The red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against my front door like a rhythmic warning, casting long, distorted shadows across the foyer I had painted myself just 3 summers ago. I stood behind the glass of the sidelight, motionless, watching my wife, Clara, screaming for help on the porch. She had torn the silk collar of her dress and mussed her blonde hair into a frantic nest, her face a mask of calculated, rehearsed terror as she shouted to the neighbors that I was inside, attacking her. At that moment, I wasn't just a husband, I was a man watching a structural collapse in real time. I held my tablet in my hand, the screen glowing with the live 4K feed of the security cameras she didn't know I'd installed. I wasn't afraid. As an architect, I knew that before you can rebuild, you have to let the condemned structure fall. I let her scream for exactly 3 minutes, long enough for the false police report to be a felony, long enough for the neighbor's porch lights to flicker on, and long enough for her to realize that the boring, predictable man she had married was finally done playing his part. I let her scream until the first officer's hand touched the holster of his taser, and then, with the calm of a man finishing a blueprint, I finally opened the door. But to understand how we got to that porch, you have to understand the grid. My life has always been defined by the absolute necessity of precision. As an architectural draftsman, I spend my days ensuring that every line is perfectly perpendicular, that every load-bearing wall has the support it needs to withstand the weight of the world, and that every measurement is accurate to the millimeter. By night, I coach high school baseball, a game of diamond geometry where a single inch determines a home run or a foul ball. I applied that same rigid precision to my marriage. We met 5 years ago at a wedding that felt like a movie set, a grand estate in the countryside where the humidity of that July evening felt like a heavy blanket. I remember the smell of jasmine, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the way the string quartet sounded slightly out of tune. When Clara was seated at my table, the world suddenly made sense. She was a burst of chaotic energy, a splash of vibrant color that balanced my black and white order. We talked until the candles burned down to stubs of wax. We danced until the stars began to fade into the dawn. At the time, I thought I had found the missing piece of my life's design. We were married 2 years later in a ceremony I meticulously planned, right down to the direction the chairs faced to catch the exact moment the sun dipped below the horizon. For a long time, the foundation felt solid. I poured everything I had into our home, a beautiful, sprawling suburban colonial that I had renovated with my own hands. I saw our life together as my greatest masterpiece. But about 14 months ago, I began to feel a vibration in the structure, a subtle, unsettling settling of the earth that suggested something deep underneath was rotting. It wasn't a sudden crack in the wall, it was a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts. The first sign wasn't a lipstick stain or a late-night phone call. It was the driver's seat of her silver SUV. I am a man of habit, I maintain our vehicles with religious devotion. I check the oil every month and keep the tires at exactly 32 psi. Because I often used her car on Tuesdays to haul heavy bags of baseball equipment to the fields, I knew exactly how that driver's seat felt. I'm 6'1", Clara is 5'4". One Tuesday afternoon, I sat in her car and realized my knees were hitting the steering column. The seat wasn't all the way forward for her, and it wasn't all the way back for me. It was in the middle, adjusted for someone about 5'9". I didn't say anything that day. I just adjusted the seat, gripped the steering wheel, and felt a cold, sharp needle of suspicion prick my chest. I tried to dismiss it as a mechanic's adjustment or a valet's whim, but the seed was planted, and in the quiet of my home office, it began to grow. Over the next few months, Clara became a ghost in the margins of our life. The woman who used to greet me with a hug and a play-by-play of her day at the marketing firm became a stranger who lived behind the blue light of her smartphone. She began working late with increasing frequency, but when she returned, she didn't smell like the stale office coffee and old paper I was used to. She smelled of a heavy, masculine scent, tobacco, cedar, and an expensive leather cologne that I didn't own. Our physical life became a desert. Every time I reached for her in the dark, she was overstimulated or had a headache that no medicine could touch. She started sleeping with her phone tucked securely under her pillow, and I watched her from the corner of my eye as she tilted the screen at a precise 15-degree angle away from my line of sight. When I finally gathered the courage to ask what was wrong, she didn't offer a bridge, she offered an insult. She called me suffocating. She told me I was insecure and that my need for order was stifling her spirit. It was a classic gaslighting maneuver, a psychological demolition designed to make me doubt my own eyes so she could continue her work in the dark. I decided then to stop being a husband and start being an investigator. I became a ghost in my own house, a silent observer of my own tragedy. I stopped the affection, stopped the questioning, and leaned into the rigid persona she had assigned me. I waited for her to get comfortable in her lies. The breaking point finally came on a humid Saturday morning while she was in the shower, singing a song I didn't recognize. I went to her SUV in the driveway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I searched the glove box, the center console, and under the seats, finding nothing but old receipts and gum wrappers. Finally, I opened the trunk and looked at the hardshell roadside emergency kit I had bought her when we first got engaged. I opened the latch, and there, tucked beneath a pair of heavy-duty jumper cables, was a cheap, black burner phone. I took the phone to my basement office, locked the door, and plugged it into my workstation. My hands shook so violently I could barely hit the keys to bypass the simple 4-digit passcode, her birthday, of course. When the screen flickered to life, my world disintegrated. It wasn't just a brief fling, it was a year-long, systematic demolition of our marriage. There was only one contact in the phone, labeled simply as work. I opened the messages and read words I can never unread. They mocked my predictable nature. They laughed about how I believed her late nights at the office excuses. And then I saw the name of the man, Julian. Julian was 25, a junior architect I had mentored at my firm. I had spent countless hours teaching him how to read blueprints, how to understand the stress points of a building, and how to carry himself with integrity. I had invited him into our home for dinner. I had treated him like a younger brother. Seeing his face on that screen, seeing the photos they had sent each other in the bed I had paid for, felt like a physical blow to the stomach. I sat in the dark for 3 hours, the blue light of the laptop reflecting off my glasses, staring at the ruins of my life. I realized then that my marriage wasn't just failing, it had been a hollow shell for a long time, and I was the only one still trying to hold up the roof. I didn't confront her that day. I knew that if I did, she would use every manipulative trick in her bag, she would cry, she would lie, and she would delete every scrap of evidence before the sun went down. I am an architect, and I know that when a structure is condemned, you don't just kick a wall. You document the decay. I began what I called the shadow game. Over the next week, I created an evidence ledger. I spent my nights, while she thought I was buried in drafting work, exporting every text, every timestamped photo, and every GPS location tag from that burner phone. I cross-referenced them with our joint bank statements. I found that on the day of our second anniversary, while she told me she was stuck at a client dinner, she was actually at a boutique hotel downtown with Julian. I found receipts for jewelry I'd never seen and dinners I'd never eaten. I printed everything, page after page, until I had a 2-inch thick leather binder. It was the most important presentation of my life. On Monday morning, I took the binder to an attorney named Vance. In the legal circles of our city, he was known as the Vulture. He didn't care about the emotional wreckage, he only cared about the assets. We sat in his office, which smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition. He flipped through my binder with a clinical expression that slowly shifted into a predatory smirk. He told me that because we lived in an at-fault state, this wasn't just a divorce, it was a tactical strike. He explained that Clara had effectively forfeited her claim to my premarital assets, the house I had bought with my inheritance and the cabin I had built with my father. He told me to stay silent. He told me to let her keep lying, because every lie she told from that moment on would be another nail in her financial coffin. For the next 10 days, I lived a double life that nearly broke me. I sat across from her at the dinner table, listening to her complain about her stressful day at the office, knowing exactly whose arms she had been in 3 hours earlier. I watched her smile at her phone under the table, knowing it was Julian on the other side. The rage was a cold, heavy stone in my chest, but I kept it locked behind a wall of professional indifference. I began the process of desouling the house. I moved my personal valuables, my grandfather's watch, my rare coin collection, my expensive coaching equipment, to a secure storage unit. I was stripping the house of everything that mattered to me, leaving only the furniture and the memories for her to fight over. I began to notice the small ways she tried to maintain the illusion. She would come home and tell me about a meeting with a client named Sarah, and I would check the burner phone later to see that Sarah was actually the code name for their afternoon trysts at a local park. The level of detail in her deception was staggering. It made me realize that I had never truly known the woman I married. The Clara I loved was a blueprint she had drawn to get what she wanted, and now that she had it, she was bored with the design. I spent my days at the architecture firm, watching Julian walk past my office. I watched him flirt with the interns and carry himself with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he had won. He had no idea that I held his entire career and reputation in a leather binder under my desk. Before I served the final papers, I had one more duty to perform. I couldn't let another innocent person live in the dark I had just escaped. I knew Julian was engaged to a woman named Sarah, a schoolteacher who was, by all accounts, as kind and devoted as I had been. I messaged her from an anonymous account and asked to meet at a small, gross hipster coffee shop on the edge of town, a place with mismatched furniture and the smell of burnt espresso. When she arrived, she looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room. I sat across from her and placed a thin manila folder on the table. I watched her world collapse in slow motion as she looked at the photos of Julian and my wife. She didn't scream, she just stared at a photo of her fiancé kissing Clara in the back of an SUV. "He told me he was working late to help you with the Civic Center project," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I haven't seen Julian outside of a staff meeting in 6 months, Sarah," I said, my heart aching for her. "I'm sorry. You deserve a life built on a better foundation than this." I left her there with the truth, a heavy burden that I knew she would eventually turn into a weapon. When I returned home that evening, the house felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the things we weren't saying. Clara was in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, watching a reality show about people finding their forever homes. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. She looked up at me and sighed, that familiar sound of practiced annoyance. "You're home late, Elias. Working on another one of your boring blueprints?" "Actually, Clara, I'm finishing the final version," I said, my voice as steady as the floorboards beneath us. "You're so rigid," she remarked, turning back to the TV. "You really need to learn to relax. You're going to give yourself a heart attack before you're 40. "I just like things to be structurally sound," I replied. "I don't like hidden flaws." She just hummed in response, completely oblivious to the fact that the walls were about to come down. That night, I sat in the guest room, watching the clock. I had the process server scheduled for 10 a.m. the next morning. It was a Tuesday, her favorite day for her Pilates class. I knew she would be at her office, feeling invincible and clever. I wanted her social death to be as precise as a surgical strike. I wanted everyone who looked up to her to see her for exactly who she was. I didn't sleep a wink. I just watched the second hand of my watch sweep around the dial, over and over, counting down to the moment I would finally be free of the lie. The blueprint was finished. The evidence was secured. The trap was set. All that was left was to pull the trigger and watch the condemned structure fall. The morning of the serving felt like the pressurized atmosphere before a massive summer storm, thick, electrified, and heavy with the scent of ozone. I watched Clara leave the house at 8:30 a.m. She was wearing a new silk dress, one I hadn't bought her, and she hummed a melody I didn't recognize as she checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. She blew me a distracted, practiced kiss, the kind you give to a piece of furniture you've grown used to, and walked out the door. I stood at the window, watching her SUV pull out of the driveway, noticing for the last time that the driver's seat was perfectly adjusted for her 5'9" shadow. I didn't go to the firm that morning. I called in and told my boss I had a family emergency. I sat in my home office and watched the seconds tick by on my desk clock. 10 a.m. That was the mark. At exactly 10:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Vance's office, service complete. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, imagining the scene at her marketing firm. I knew the layout of her office, I had helped her pick the artwork for the lobby. I saw the process server walking past the glass-walled conference rooms, the confusion of the receptionist, and Clara being called out of her weekly strategy meeting to sign for a manila envelope in front of her manager and her peers. I wanted her to feel the eyes on her. I wanted the whispers to start. Before she even reached the first page of the filing. I wanted her to realize that the boring, predictable man she thought she was married to had just orchestrated her public undoing with the surgical precision of an engineer. I spent the next 3 hours moving the last of my essential belongings into the guest room and double-checking the security feed. I had installed 3 new 4K cameras, one disguised as a doorbell, 2 hidden in the eaves, all recording to a secure cloud server that she couldn't access. I wasn't just protecting my home anymore, I was building a courtroom in my front yard. By 5 p.m., the storm arrived. My phone had been a glowing brick of notifications for hours. 42 missed calls. 78 text messages. They started with feigned confusion. "Elias, what is this joke? Is this some kind of sick prank?" Then they moved to blistering rage. "How dare you do this at my work? You've ruined my reputation. You're a coward and a monster." Finally, they moved to the desperate manipulation I expected. "Pick up the phone, Elias. We need to talk, this is all a massive misunderstanding. I can explain everything if you just listen." I didn't reply to a single one. I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the tablet on my lap, watching the driveway. At 5:45 p.m., a car that wasn't hers, likely a ride-share, as she was probably too shaken or intoxicated to drive, screeched to a halt at the curb. Clara didn't walk to the door, she charged. The sound of her pounding on the oak door was deafening, a frantic, irregular rhythm that shook the frame. It wasn't the knock of a wife returning home, it was the hammering of a ghost trying to claw its way back into the world of the living. "Elias, open this door. I know you're in there. Stop being a child," she screamed. I watched her on the monitor. Her face was flushed a deep, ugly red, her hair disheveled from the wind and her own frantic hands. She tried her key, but the tumblers wouldn't turn. I had replaced the locks at noon. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She began to kick the door, her expensive heels leaving deep scuff marks on the paint I had meticulously applied. "You can't do this. This is my house. I'll call the police." I remained silent, a statue in the shadows. I wanted her to exhaust herself. I wanted her to reveal every jagged layer of the person she had become when the mask was finally stripped away. For 20 minutes, she ranted. She told me I was a pathological freak, that I was obsessive, and that Julian was 10 times the man I would ever be. She admitted to the affair in her rage, shouting it at the wood of the door as if the house itself were her confessor. "He's younger. He's better. He actually makes me feel alive, unlike you and your stupid blueprints," she shrieked. And then, she saw our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, walking his dog across the street, his eyes wide with shock. Her demeanor changed in a heartbeat. It was a terrifying transformation to witness, a masterclass in sociopathic adaptation. She stopped screaming insults and started screaming for help. She began to muss her hair even further, tearing at the silk collar of her dress until it hung limply from her shoulder. She threw herself against the door frame, making a loud thud, and began to shriek, "Help! He's hitting me! Mr. Henderson, call the police! He's snapped! He's killing me!" My heart didn't race, it went cold. If I hadn't prepared, that single, calculated lie could have ended my career, my reputation, and my freedom in a matter of seconds. I watched her through the high-definition lens as she slid to the porch floor, sobbing hysterically for the benefit of the street. Within 6 minutes, the sirens began to wail, echoing through the quiet suburb. 3 cruisers pulled up, their red and blue lights strobing against the white siding of the house like a disco of the damned. I stood up, smoothed my shirt, and walked to the foyer. I didn't open the door until I saw the officers reach the porch steps. I kept my hands open and visible, palms out, as I pulled the door inward. Clara immediately lunged toward the lead officer, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at me. "He hit me. He found out I wanted to leave him and he attacked me. Look at my clothes. Look at what he did. Arrest him." The lead officer, a man with graying temples and a weary expression that suggested he'd seen every version of human misery, looked at me, then at Clara's torn dress, then back at me. "Sir, step out onto the porch with your hands behind your head. Now." "Officer," I said, my voice as flat and steady as a sheet of steel. "Before you take another step or reach for those cuffs, I want you to look at this." I held out my tablet, which was already playing the recorded loop of the last 30 minutes. I didn't say a word as the 2 officers huddled around the screen. They watched the 4K footage of Clara pulling up in the rideshare. They watched her scream at the locked door. And then, they watched her, completely alone on the porch, deliberately tear her own dress, muss her own hair, and look toward the neighbor's house before beginning her performance of a woman being assaulted. They watched the sidelight window, where I was clearly visible 10 feet away, sitting motionless in a chair, never having touched the door. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the officer's radio. The lead officer looked at Clara, who was still trying to squeeze out a tear, unaware the game was over. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with a tone of pure professional disgust. "Stand up. You're under arrest for filing a false police report, disturbing the peace, and public intoxication. You have the right to remain silent." "What? No. He's the one. The video it's a trick. He's an architect, he faked it with his computers," she shrieked as they pulled her arms behind her back. The handcuffs clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that felt like the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. As they led her to the cruiser, the neighbors watching from their lawns, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. There was no joy in seeing her ruined. There was only the relief of a job finished. I watched the taillights of the cruisers disappear into the night, and for the first time in 14 months, the house was truly, beautifully quiet. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove north. I didn't want to be in that house anymore. I didn't want to see the scuff marks on the front door or the spot on the sofa where she used to sit and lie to my face. I drove to the cabin my father and I had built years ago on the edge of a nameless lake. There is no cell service there, no internet, just the ancient, rhythmic silence of the woods. I spent a week in a state of primal therapy. I woke up at dawn, chopped wood until my palms were raw and blistered, and fished the cold, deep waters of the lake. I shot an 8-point buck on the 3rd day, a clean, ethical shot that felt like a reset button for my soul. I spent the evenings cleaning the meat and sitting by the fire, staring into the embers. I realized then that Clara hadn't just cheated on me, she had tried to rewrite my reality. She had tried to make me believe I was the problem so she wouldn't have to face the fact that she was the one who was hollow. Elena, Clara's younger sister, drove up on Thursday. She was the only person I had given a key to. She found me on the porch, sharpening a skinning knife. She sat on the steps and didn't say anything for a long time. Mom and Dad saw the video, Elias, she finally said. Vance sent it to their lawyer along with the rest of the binder. They're heartbroken. Not because of the divorce, but because they realized they didn't know their own daughter. I didn't want them to see her like that, Elena, I said. But I couldn't let her send me to jail. I know. None of us blame you. She's staying in a motel on the highway right now. Mom won't let her back in the house until she agrees to go to rehab or therapy. She keeps telling everyone you trapped her with those cameras. She doesn't get it. She doesn't understand that the cameras didn't make her a liar. They just caught her being one. Elena stayed for 2 days. We talked about her grad school applications and baseball. She was the only part of that family I wanted to keep, a structural element that was still sound. The final legal meeting took place a month later in a glass-walled conference room downtown. Clara looked haggard. Her expensive highlights had grown out into dark, messy roots, and her eyes were sunken and sallow. She sat across from me, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman I loved. I saw a faulty design. Her lawyer tried to argue forth lifestyle maintenance and a portion of my premarital cabin. Vance didn't even argue. He simply leaned forward and placed the criminal report from the night of her arrest on the table, alongside the 14 months of burner phone logs. "We aren't here to negotiate," Vance said, his voice cold and clinical. "We are here to dictate the terms of your surrender. My client is keeping the house, the cabin, and 100% of his retirement accounts. He is offering a $5,000 relocation fee and her SUV, which he has generously paid off this morning. If you decline, we go to trial on Monday. And I will ensure that every local news outlet receives a copy of that porch video. I will make sure every marketing firm in the tri-state area knows that your client is a serial liar who weaponizes the police against innocent men. What's it going to be?" Clara's lawyer looked at the evidence, then at his client, and gave a slow, somber shake of his head. Clara looked at me, her eyes brimming with a desperate, manipulative hope that I would cave one last time. "Elias, please. Think of the years we had. Think of the wedding. Doesn't any of that mean anything?" "It meant everything to me, Clara," I said. "That's why I documented exactly how you destroyed it. You didn't just break a heart, you tried to break a life. Sign the papers." She signed. The sound of the pen on the vellum was the final line on the blueprint. I sold the suburban house 3 months later. I didn't care about the profit, I just wanted the memories of her betrayal purged from my existence. I bought a loft downtown, an industrial space of glass, steel, and exposed brick. There are no hidden corners in my new home. There are no phones under pillows. I still coach the high school baseball team, and I still draft buildings. I found that my work became better, more daring. I stopped trying to build fortresses to keep the world out and started building spaces that invited the light in. I heard later that Sarah, Julian's fiancée, had moved to the coast and was teaching again. Julian had been quietly asked to leave our firm after the ethics scandal broke. In our industry, no one wants a junior architect who lacks a basic moral compass. He's working in a hardware store now, I hear, fitting for a man who didn't understand how to maintain a foundation. Sometimes, in the quiet of the late night, I look out at the city skyline from my balcony. I think about the year I spent in the shadow game. I think about the pain, the cold rage, and the absolute precision it took to survive her demolition. I don't regret a single second of it. I learned that I am capable of more than just drawing lines, I am capable of defending them. I learned that a heart can break and still remain structurally sound. I am Elias. I am a builder. And for the first time in my life, I'm not building for an audience or a dream that was a lie. I'm building for myself. The blueprint is finished. The lines are clean. The house is finally, truly, mine. I realized that the silence of my new life was a sanctuary. I no longer had to analyze the tone of a text message or wonder about a seat adjustment in a car. I began to rediscover the man I was before I had tried to anchor my happiness to a ghost. My office in the new loft became my favorite place, a testament to clarity. I've begun work on a new community center, a project designed around the concept of transparency. Every Saturday, the baseball field remains my grounding force. I tell my players that the game is won in the small things, the things no one sees until they fail. They respect me for it. They know I don't miss a thing. As for Clara, Elena tells me she moved again, still blaming the system for her downfall. But I don't listen much anymore. I've learned that while you can plan for every load-bearing wall and every structural beam, the heart is the one thing you can never truly put on a blueprint. It is chaotic, and sometimes, it needs to be completely demolished before it can be rebuilt. And as I look out over the city tonight, I know that my foundation is finally, undeniably solid. The lines are straight. The air is clear. And for the first time, I truly like the view. I am no longer waiting for the cracks to appear, I am the one who ensures they never do. My life is mine, and it is built to last.